Hi everyone. Today we're going to try something a bit different. This is the first video in what might be a series where I talk about what impact AI is having on different professions and what the future of the job might look like. With me here today, we have my friend Ursula, who is a YouTuber and also a therapist in Germany. So we're going to ask her a lot about her day-to-day. And then we'll be focusing on 3 questions. What is it like to be a therapist? How will AI change the job? And how will AI change society? Keep watching to learn more. So Ursula, what is it like to be a therapist? Or just tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this series and being the first person. We talk a lot about AI and development. Therefore, I was super curious to talk to you and see how jobs could change. And as you introduced me, I'm a psychotherapist in Germany, and my day-to-day is talking to people with all kinds of different mental illnesses. And I'm wondering, how do I have to change? What do I have to learn? What's developing in the AI world I should know about? And is there anything I don't see, what you probably see? If I don't react to it, if I don't learn, if I just say the same, might someday replace my job. Therefore, I'm super happy that we can have such an interesting conversation today.
Thank you for being here. Of course, Ursula and I actually talk fairly frequently as YouTubers. And so she strongly encouraged me to start trying this type of video. So I'm looking forward to see how it does. And I think to me, the interesting part about being a therapist is that you are having to think not just about the content of what people say, but you have to think, how is their brain machinery and their emotions and their experience and everything coming together into the small number of words they're actually saying, right? There's so much going on behind the background. In fact, I can't remember if it was you. I think it was another friend of mine who's a therapist who said when she became a therapist, it's easy for other people to feel a little afraid of you, to blame you, to feel like you have a power of witchcraft to understand what people are thinking, and they don't want anyone looking inside that closely. So I'm just curious if how do people react to you when they learn that you're a therapist?
Well, earlier when I was younger, people said, now you're analyzing me, now you know, like I would have witchcraft. But it's not like that. It's a science you can learn. It's not some superpower, and it's much more than having a coffee with a friend, even though it looks from the outside, it appears so easy. There are 2 people sitting in a room talking, so why do I have to pay for that? I can talk to a friend. Why do I need a therapist for that? But nowadays people react to me in a different way than just being afraid of me or saying, oh, you're analyzing me and I don't want you to analyze me. But people are curious and want to learn. I think it's because much more knowledge on Instagram and YouTube and many other social media channels, that there is a much more, in some way, much more realistic way to think about therapy. And in the other way, it gets a bit washed up. There is a form of spirituality which is not a typical part of psychotherapy, at least as I've been taught here in Germany.
Yeah, I feel like in recent years, it became a little bit more acceptable. I don't know about in Germany, but it became more acceptable to talk about therapy, to say, I see a therapist, to recommend that to others that they see a therapist. It's still easy to offend somebody that way, but I feel like it really entered mainstream conversation where maybe it wouldn't have been there before.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. I noticed that in Germany as well. It's not a taboo. You don't talk about it because then, oh my God, what's wrong with you? But more of I need help, and there is much more information out there how to get in contact with therapists. For example, in Germany, you don't need a doctor's note to go to a therapist. You can just call a therapist. We are very thought out. So if you want to have an appointment with a therapist, you call and you don't receive directly an appointment with a therapist, but you have to leave your name, then you get on a waiting list, and then we call you. It's just because of the enormous amount of volume of demand for a therapist. And then we have a first conversation about your symptoms to see what's going on. If we can help you, or if your symptoms are very strong, then obviously you need to see a doctor in a hospital and stay there for a while. But to make the first contact, there is a very low barrier. And I think that helped to make it more accessible, less taboo.
Interesting. So what is the day-to-day job like for you? Do you see a lot of patients all at once? Do you see individual patients throughout the day? Does it feel exhausting? Does it feel rewarding? What is the day-to-day like for you?
My day-to-day is that I offer two sorts of therapy, and I also offer this first appointments, the first contact, which means I help you to understand, is there any diagnosis that describes your symptoms? Or don't you even need to go to therapy, which is an important thing to know. Do I need therapy, yes or no? And that's one day I have in my weekly schedule, one entire day of seeing, let's see, about 5 to 7 people every week for the first time, and checking whether they need therapy. And on the other days, I work on individual therapy and group therapy. That's what I offer. My day-to-day is, I meet people in my practice, and I also meet people online. During the pandemic, we met people a lot online, but I notice more and more that people don't like to work online anymore. So if I offer, we could also talk online if that's easier for you. Let's say, about 95% of my patients say, if there is any chance I can come to the practice to see you there, I will come. I will do whatever is needed. I come and see you there. So that's an important point. I notice that at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought, well, therapy would shift into online therapy only, or would shift much more into online therapy. But now we notice more and more that people really want to come to have this, I was about to say this personal connection, but online it's also personal. But face-to-face is much more valuable, but much more sought after, from what I notice with my patients.
I imagine that when you meet in person, it engages more of your brain, and the patient feels like it engages more of their brain too, because they have to see and hear and judge distance and all kinds of stuff. Do you think that it's easier for you as a therapist to practice online?
No, for me, I thought at the beginning it would be really hard to practice online because I miss all the contextual cues. But then I noticed, or my brain learned, there are other cues, like how does the voice really sound like? Or what are microfacial expressions? Or I learned to look more at the background. Does anything change? So I looked for different cues, from cues I don't get as close up in person, like in front of the camera. So for me, it was a change in cues, what I had to look out for. But for many of my colleagues, they said, I miss so much of the body language because I can only see the face and I don't see what the feet are doing. Is that person nervous? I can't see it. I can't see the feet, or I can't see the hands. Maybe the patient is very nervous but sits on his or her hand, and I can't see hand gestures, hand movement. But I learned to look out for different cues.
And what's it like when you're in an actual session with somebody and you're trying to listen to what they say, but also look out for all those cues? And also maybe you have hypotheses or ideas running in your head, and how much of your brain power is dedicated to what they're actually saying, and how much of the useful information is coming from what they're actually saying versus the cues And do you let them drive the conversation? Do you try to step in sometimes? I'm assuming there are situations when it's good to do one or the other, but I'm just kind of curious what that actually looks like when you're sitting in the same room as somebody.
I can tell you that it looks like 100% to listening and writing, but I would guess it's at least 50%, if not more, to what is beneath the words. Which other cues are in the room? How is somebody looking? How do I feel about the things I hear? Therefore, it might look very easy and like a conversation with a friend, as I said, but it's at least 50 to 60% of what are the cues, which other information is in the room, what kind of questions can I ask to find out what's really going on.
Interesting. So do you feel like you have to have a really good mental model of the person you're talking to? You have to put yourself in their shoes. Do you have to be able to guess what they're going to say next? Or does that not really matter? And it's more like, how are they acting right now? And you don't have to really predict that.
Well, I do both. I try to have a mental model of my patient's reality. I often say, well, if I would do, for example, if I would do your job, or if I would live where you live, what would I see? What would I think? What would I hear? I need to have an image in my mind what this person's life looks like, or this person's job look like, to be able to understand the meaning of the words I'm hearing. And while I do that, I also look at all the cues in the room. What's going on? When does, for example, the facial expression change? When does the color of the face changes? When is more movement on the chair? When do I feel nervous? When do I feel pressure? That's all going on at the same time. Even though I might look very still and I might only hold a pen and don't even write. That's going on in my head. There is no other room. There is no room for other things than everything that happens in the session. So it takes all of my brain power to to understand what's going on during the session.
So you became an expert in human behavior, it sounds like. You put all the pieces together to figure out what's really happening behind the scenes, even if the person's not conscious of it.
Well, I often consider myself and tell people that I'm working more like a Sherlock Holmes of psychotherapy. I'm looking for pieces. I'm trying to solve a puzzle. I don't know the answer. I didn't get handed a manual how whomever works. I need to solve the puzzle and I need to work out how the problem which is presented currently can be treated and where does it stem from. And not everybody reacts to the same problem in the same way. Therefore, I was wondering, as I mentioned before, how could AI change my job or help with my job or replace me at my job? Maybe AI someday is much better than me, recognizing all the cues. I don't know. Therefore, I'm super happy that I can ask you now.
That seems like a great segue into the second part of our video, which is how will AI change your job, if at all? My initial impression is that you have to be really, really flexible. You have to think on your feet. Every patient is presenting slightly differently. I'm sure that there'll be patients that remind you of previous situations. So you're like, oh, I know how to think about this. I know how to talk about this because I've seen something similar before. Mm-hmm. But even more so than other types of medicine where the same thing happens, right? People presenting with an illness might show very different symptoms than someone else. I feel like you have much smaller puzzle pieces, right? You don't have like a CAT scan being like, yeah, this part of the brain has like some different activity going on. You have very small puzzle pieces. Oh, look, their left foot shifted an inch and then they're tapping it. So I feel like first of all that your job requires a lot of lived human experience as it's presented and as you do it today, right? You have to know how would this person feel in this situation? What does tapping a foot mean?
For this special person.
That's right. Compared to this other person who's just habitually always moving around, so them tapping their foot doesn't mean anything. So I feel like that would be very hard to automate, like the core of it, because you basically spent a lifetime collecting information on how humans behave, and you relate it to your own experience. You know what it feels like to be sad or to be upset or to be frustrated, not just in a clinical sense, but you have lived experience of that. And that probably makes it easier for you to understand what's happening with the patients in front of you. If you were trying to make an AI system that would replace that core part of your job, it would have to take in all of that information and also take in the interventions that you did to try to figure out, in this situation, this intervention is appropriate. And it would need a lot of training data because of the amount of variability that's going on. It would need a lot of sensors as well, right? It has to be able to see, hear, what other senses?
And smell.
See, hear, smell, just like all the senses that a human would have, and maybe more, right? To try to really see what's really going on for that patient.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me like, the core of that, you need really good robotics, first of all. You need really good robotics processing capabilities, like understanding of vision and understanding of speech and sound and all kinds of things, before you can even start gathering the data that is necessary to actually try to train a model. And then once you go to train the model, you would actually need a lot of examples of what the therapist actually did, which is probably a nightmare from a privacy perspective, right? Hey, can I have 1 million examples of what German doctors did in this situation? So I think that the core of that job is very essentially human. I don't think that it would be easy to really automate like your own judgment as a therapist and the input you're getting and what you're deciding to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that any therapist is perfect at what they do. Of course, everyone would have their own biases about how they approach things and so on. So one human therapist might be more effective for a certain patient than someone else, and that's totally natural. So the benefit of trying to get an AI system to do that is that hopefully it could take the best of your type of practice and the best of your colleagues' type of practice as well and put it together. But it has to see 10,000 examples of how you do it and also 10,000 examples of how your colleague does it to be able to form that like composite reasoning and intervention ability, I would think.
That's super interesting. I heard on the news that AI is used in the UK to at least help to find a therapist. The system in the UK apparently is a bit different from Germany. You call one number and you get allocated or get an appointment with one therapist. So apparently AI systems are able to set up appointments.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's lots of ways that AI will probably change like the periphery of your job, I would think, right? Including how patients get selected, how long, when someone is told that they should be seeing a therapist, right? Like you said, you're doing a lot of that you're doing a lot of that analysis yourself up front. Hey, is this person sitting in front of me? Will they benefit from seeing a therapist? I imagine people will try to automate a lot of that because you can probably get the people that need to see a therapist in front of a therapist faster if the system is like, yeah, this person really needs this help, they could benefit from it. And it sounds like the UK is already trying to do that, so that makes sense. Do you ever give homework or exercises or like, please think about this to your patients? Because it's possible that like there might be some systems that would help patients manage that type of thing as well.
Yes, we have different kinds of homeworks. Sometimes we already have like an app or a worksheet patients can work through. So there is already something set up, something ready. And I combine that with questions that arise during the session. And I tell my patients, well, please think about this question until the next session and bring everything you found, even though you think it might not matter or it's irrelevant. Bring everything to the session and let's see what we can find out there. Maybe there are some puzzle pieces we haven't thought about. So I do both.
That's very interesting. So you could imagine as well that there might be an AI system that could be suggesting things to you, the therapist, right? Based on a recording of the conversation or something like, hey, here are the 3 exercises that might be helpful here. And based on what I heard in this conversation, here's how you could say this one, and you could look at it and say, oh, I actually think that the second of these exercises is pretty good, and the AI system picked up on this attribute that I didn't think about. I'm going to change it because I still think that this is a better way to approach it. But you can imagine it providing support to therapists in that way, especially like therapists that are less experienced.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very, very interesting to think about it that way. I think what we tried during the pandemic, or the healthcare system in Germany tried during the pandemic to relieve the pressure on psychotherapy practices, because a lot of people are looking for therapy, is introducing apps for different topics. For depression, eating disorders, anxiety disorders. The hopes were really, really high that a lot of people would benefit in very noticeable ways from those apps, which means that they would not need therapy at all. I don't have the exact statistics, but I hear from patients who have used those apps that it helped them to understand, to learn how, for example, panic attacks or depression or sleeping disorders work. But they said, well, I still need something more, and I can't describe what it is exactly, but now I understand. But
I also wanted to ask, how, once you've figured out what's going on in a patient's mind, how do you sort of tell them what's going on, or how do you bring them in the right direction when it comes to addressing whatever the problems they're having? I'm assuming you have to kind of step in at one point and start making suggestions, or step in and point out that, hey, you seem really nervous right now. Maybe that's a sign or something. You know, how do you think about that, and when do you think about the first point at which you are going to start taking intervention?
Oh, that's a question I asked my supervisors during my training period a lot. The training takes 5 years, and I asked that a lot. When do I say that? When do I know? How do I know? And it's a big part of tweaking it. You never exactly know, but with seeing a lot of patients, you learn when to step in and when to ask, and when you have a good enough connection to be able to ask that question without the patient feeling offended, or that the patient feels that I crossed a boundary and then shuts down the conversation and says, well, I don't want to talk about it. You went too far. That's not our topic. I work, especially at the beginning, I work a lot with goals. What's your goal for therapy? Let's think how you can reach that goal, and what's beneath that goal. What else do you need to reach that goal from me? It's not purely information. Obviously, as everybody else, Google a lot. But what do I do with that information, and how can I implement that information in my life? So I was, when I was thinking about the apps, I was wondering if more of AI would be incorporated in those apps, and what they would do. Maybe that's the next step in those apps, incorporating more AI and more conversation.
Yeah, if you think about it, generative AI, like the ChatGPTs of the world, generative AI is really good at understanding a conversation and picking up small cues from it and figuring out exactly what you're trying to get at. It can't think in a very deep manner, and this is something I talk about on my channel a fair amount, which is that the neural network architectures behind ChatGPT and Gemini and other systems, they're feed-forward neural networks, which basically means the neurons are connected in a way that information can only feed one direction. So you ask it something, and then it's kind of like thinking about it for a certain time, and then the output neurons happen and it has to output something. A human has more cyclical connections in their brain, so they can actually think about something over and over. You can ruminate and come back with a very fully formed thought, but a large language model can't really do that. It has a limited kind of thinking capacity. So there's only so much you can expect it to do right now without a lot of careful prompting and saying, okay, please output your intermediate thoughts along the way so that you can get to a more complicated task. But I think that models are really good at picking up cues for example, and assuming that you are a 14-year-old girl and kind of talking to you that way because that's the language that you're using to talk to it. Or comparing the language that you are using now to the messages that you had put previously and going, oh, these messages are really short in comparison, or the diction level seems angrier, or whatever. I think they're very good at judging that sort of thing, the nuances of communication, basically. So I imagine that at some point, therapy is going to look like a person just talking to an AI chatbot and trying to figure out what to do, what to say, and the AI chatbot trying to make suggestions back. It might be like an initial phase. For example, during that evaluation phase that the UK is trying to do, they could give you a chatbot and say, just talk to it for a little bit. And then you could analyze the results and go, yes, this person needs to see a human therapist based on what we've seen and based on our capacity of human therapists at the moment. Or maybe they should just continue talking to this chatbot and maybe that will help them over time. There's actually an article about, I think it was the US Army creating a virtual therapist, like a chatbot that they would give to veterans who had fought in some wars and were really, traumatized by the experience. And probably these people should have been seeing human therapists, but I'm guessing that the cost was just too great or the logistics were just too great to make sure that all the veterans were getting access to this type of thing. So they just made this chatbot and they gave it to people and they saw a lot of uptick in it. People felt like they needed to talk to someone. They had things to work through. And I guess the chatbot, even though it's not a human and it can't analyze your posture and figure out a lot of things about you, it was able to understand enough context that it was able to provide useful thoughts and I assume it was trained with strategies on how to be a therapist, right? Like you can ask the patient, hey, maybe you should talk more about that. Hey, tell me about this. Hey, what does that look like? And then also it probably had to make the same judgment call that you have to make at some point, which is when do I start intervening? When do I start saying things? Unless it's just very passive the whole time. I don't know. If you think about how AI automates jobs, there's kind of three ways that it happens. Either it replaces the job entirely, which is difficult for most jobs, but it does happen. And the second, much more common way is that it starts supplying tools that the existing practitioners of the job use to be more efficient, to be more effective. That's what I said, where maybe some bot or whatever is going to make suggestions like, hey, maybe you should give this exercise to the person, or maybe a little green light lights up and says, I think this patient is feeling pretty good right now. If you are trying to broach a really difficult subject, I'm giving you the thumbs up on it. A tool for the therapist to rely on. And then the third way is that the paradigm just changes completely. So maybe people are not using therapists anymore because an AI chatbot is incorporated into all of their emails and it kind of summarizes it for them and explains it to them and figures out that this is going to be hurtful information. Let me change it. Let me explain it to you in a different way. And so therapy kind of gets embedded in any interaction we have with a virtual environment or something. Obviously, that wouldn't solve every instance of someone needing therapy, but it's an example of the paradigm changes. You don't sit in one place and exist until you have an issue and then you go off and see a therapist to try to address it, but it's sort of proactively incorporated into everything that you're interacting with. I can't think of any other ways that the paradigm might completely change for therapy, but it's often very hard to predict those changes in advance, right? Because it'll rely on some future technology that we can't really imagine, because if we could imagine it, we would be actively building towards it to help therapists or to replace therapists if that's what we wanted to do. And so it has to be something surprising, basically.
That's so interesting to hear someone who is not in my field thinking about my field. There is so much value in this outside perspective. Therefore, I wanted to have this conversation with you. I couldn't imagine before we talked today about it how my field could be impacted, how the changes could look, or in which direction I should think. And now I have ideas. That's really, really helpful.
Yeah, I feel like, these chatbots are going to start trying to help people, but they're going to be limited. They can't read the body language. They can't do stuff. So they have to punt to human therapists at some point. Maybe there'll be some tools that human therapists can rely on, like, speech analysis of the conversation, and it tells you something about it to make your job more easier or more effective or whatever. But yeah, the core part of it seems to me very hard to replace, right? Because so much of it depends on your lived experience as a human. So that's kind of my perspective on it.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. You said right now lived experience, and what I forgot, but always notice when it arises as a problem, is common lived experience. For example, it's much harder to be a therapist for somebody you have a totally different culture from and who has lived in a totally different place and has totally different experiences from me. I can help, but it's so much harder because I have to understand what this person's world looks like and has looked like. And with people from the same place, obviously we watched the same movies growing up and we talked about the same things on the news. Maybe that's also difficult to incorporate into AI. The subtext of I understand, I watched the same movie, I know what you're referring to, I know what it means to go to the same school, or what experience comes with XYZ.
Yeah, we've been talking about the therapist, but from the patient's perspective, I imagine a lot of patients want to see someone that they feel is sort of similar to them, right? Same gender, same experiences, same micro mannerisms or whatever in terms of communication and understanding and shared background. So I think that's another reason that a patient wouldn't really want to talk to an AI in that kind of final setting where you're dealing with a more serious situation and they have tried an AI chatbot and it doesn't make them feel any better, because they're really being very vulnerable, right? They're sharing a lot about what's going on in the innermost part of their heads. And if they're sharing that to someone that they feel like will not understand, then it's like might seem like wasted effort to them, right? Or like low value coming out of that for them. You know, I went to all this trouble, I exposed these thoughts that I didn't really want to talk about, and I'm not getting anything out of it. So, and by the same token, if you make an AI system that understands people in a therapy situation, it'll be very difficult to make different variations of that system for all of the cultural contexts around the world. So you could imagine an AI system that is trained on German therapists and like maybe can speak German as well. And maybe it does really well at helping certain classes of people that speak German that live in Germany. But then if the UK wants to reuse that system, they're probably just going to have to retrain a lot of it from scratch, right? The core methodologies might be similar, but a lot of the cultural context and understanding might be very different.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be good to be someone who is a non-English speaking therapist, because your job is even more safe.
It's so interesting to think, to really start to understand, and that's what I'm doing now with your help, how much data is needed to train an AI system on an entire job or on an entire field. And for some parts are easier to replace than others, but the fear of being replaced within the next, let's say, 2 or 3 years or 5 years is much more difficult to tackle or answer the question if somebody could be replaced. It's much more difficult than just a job description. That's what I learned now, and how huge the training set must be for AI.
At the conference that I was just at, someone said that the amount of data that went into training ChatGPT, which is enormous, it's like petabytes, that same amount of data is experienced by a newborn in like 200 hours or 600 hours or something, in terms of the amount of visual data, the amount of audio data and touch data and so on. And as humans, we become really, really good at filtering, right? Because all that noise contains only a small signal. And when we're babies, we can't really figure out what that signal is. And once you're an adult, you're not only figuring out what that signal is, you're forming thoughts about it, you're interacting with the world, you're figuring out how to help somebody or how to do a job. And it's just very different from how an AI system works, because an AI system generally is given, like, so far they've been given like one modality of information, like maybe text, and they're starting to do multimodal models, right? So they're given text and video, and they're generally unsupervised the same way that a human is. In other words, they're not told this is a video of a cat and here's the set of all cats that exist. And so they have to learn from the haystack the same way that a human does, but they're learning in isolation, right? They don't have all the other senses coming in. They don't have lots of references to other people and watching those other people grow up, and the amount of time needed to kind of change your brain to solve tasks. The more that we actually solve a task as a human, the more that task moves from system 2 into system 1, right? It kind of becomes hard-coded into our brains rather than something that we solve consciously. So when you first saw a patient, you probably had to consciously think about a lot of stuff, like noticing their legs moving and this and that. And then after some experience, you go, that person's nervous. You don't have to think about it because your brain has hard-coded and identified. And maybe if pressed, you could say, you could explain X, Y, and Z is why I think this person is nervous. That's actually what they call a post hoc explanation in AI. It's equivalent to making an AI system that takes a decision and says this person's nervous, and then you look at it afterwards and you say, why did that model say this person's nervous? Well, maybe because this neuron fired and that neuron fired, and it's probably due to the toes moving. Same thing actually happens in your brain. You have the system 2, which is capable of conscious thought, and that system 2 can go and say, oh, my snap decision about why this person was nervous, well, it's probably because their foot's moving, because now that I think about it, I see their foot moving and they're blinking a lot more than usual. That's a post hoc explanation because you don't actually know how the hard-coded part of your brain came to that realization. It's just been trained over many hours to realize some factors and to trigger in your brain. So that's the real power of humans, is that we can spend a lot of time learning something and kind of hard code it into our brain in the best representation possible based on our experience. And an AI system, if you think about it right now, is only system 1. It doesn't really have a system 2 that can come and analyze itself and figure out how it should change itself. It's been trained on tons of data to have some hard-coded, literally hard-coded, because the artificial neurons are representing information the same way that our neurons in our brain would represent information in a non-conscious way. But of course, it's impossible to say for certain that there is no system 2 going on, because I can't tell, as a human sitting across from another human, that you're actually conscious, right? We just take it as granted, we take it as a given. So it makes it even harder to compare an AI cognition and a human cognition. So if you think about the amount of training data that a human needs to actually learn to be a therapist, AI systems probably need more data at the moment, and they need specific types of data. It has to be curated and it has to be clean and not noisy. So unlike just throwing a human into the world and eventually they become a therapist, it takes a lot of work to engineer what would be a good AI system to perform some aspect of therapy. All that being said, though, we are developing more and more advanced AI systems, right? Like, we know that if we continue on this trend, we might be able to create an AI system that's as smart as a human. And that's normally called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. And if you have an AGI system, then you can do 2 things. First of all, you can just ask it, hey, can you please be a therapist? And it might be able to go out and collect the training data on its own, or maybe you give it some recordings of therapy sessions and it kind of learns and figures it out. That's kind of like the system 2 of an AI ecosystem. It's figuring out how to improve itself to get better at that job that you want it to do. And it's hard to predict how effectively that AGI system could improve itself to become a therapist or to become whatever. We have to assume that it would be improving exponentially over time. So maybe becoming a therapist is really hard for it at the beginning. And I think it would be, because there's so much of this human element to it. But because it's improving exponentially, it figures out how to be a programmer, it figures out how to be a lawyer, and then 2 years later, it figures out how to be a therapist, at least to the extent needed to help some percentage of people that are okay talking to a non-human entity. Or maybe it requires more advanced robotics before it can really, for example, mimic human facial expressions in a way that is actually comforting to somebody. So we don't know when AGI will arise, but it could be very soon. In one of my previous videos, I said it would be less than 2 years from today. That was just my guess based on what some other experts are saying. So when AGI comes, basically all bets are off, right? It becomes very hard to predict what jobs it can do, how quickly it will advance, etc. And even beyond that, we would probably eventually create super intelligence that is much smarter than humans. And when you have super intelligence, it can solve problems in ways that we can't even really plan out, right? Like, oh, let me just create some nanobots to create this new substance, to create this facsimile of a human face, and let me combine all the knowledge from a million human brains into one place so that this entity is going to be superhuman at understanding other people's emotions. And let me collect all the data from basically everyone online to really understand what emotions are. Because when you can do that, you can kind of put together more information than one human would ever be able to learn, right? Even as an expert, let's say it takes you 10 years to become an expert at recognizing human emotions, right? But if you could actually have 1,000 subjective years of time, because you just have 1,000 people that did it for 10 years, and you take all of their knowledge into one place, if that's possible, then the entity that you create is going to be literally superhuman and better than any of us could probably hope to be, as long as it can get the appropriate inputs, like seeing the patient's face and all that stuff. If it can get the same inputs to the right level of quality, it should be able to outperform us in terms of really understanding what's going on or whatever. So at that point, of course, almost every job would be replaced, right? Because it's just a matter of, do we have enough computers to run this super intelligent entity? If not, okay, just ask it to solve that first. Please make more computers. So all bets are off at that point. But yeah, if you rewind a little bit and you think about artificial general intelligence, like a human level AI. I think even that would have some difficulty interacting with people in the way that you have to do as a therapist. But it would be kind of interesting as well, because that's the first AI system that you could actually ask to just say, can you do this? Can you become a therapist? Here's sort of what's necessary. Here's how humans do it. Can you do it? And maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is just wait a few years. My big brother is coming along. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Big brother has connotations. My big sister is coming along. Anyway, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was wondering, do you think that AGI will surprise us as ChatGPT did? Or will we notice? Or how will that happen? What do you think? I mean, obviously you don't know, but ChatGPT was quite a surprise for all of us.
I think that's a good cue for our third part. How will society change as a result of AI?
Ooh.
There's a joke in the AI community that after something is created and it's been around for a while, people say that's just search. Because most AI mechanisms and models can be seen as just very sophisticated search functions.
Okay.
So, for example, when the first AI pathfinding algorithms were created, like A star, people were like, oh, that's amazing. You can solve pathfinding really, really well. And then a few years later, people are like, yeah, that's just search. And actually, if you look at it in a AI textbook now, it's probably in the search section, right? So we get used to technological advances quite quickly. So what actually surprises people is not absolute ability, but a fast change in relative ability. So before ChatGPT, there were already models that could create images just from text. And that made a bit of a splash, but very small compared to ChatGPT. There were also already models that could engage in back and forth conversation for maybe 6 attempts, for maybe 6 exchanges. And then it would kind of go off the rails because it would get confused or forget what you were saying or whatever. But that nascent ability was there since 2017 when Google made the Transformer paper. And Google had been working on this technology internally, and they were actually making it quite good, but they were really worried because they realized that it hallucinates all the time. So they'd never put it into a product. But then OpenAI had actually created, earlier versions of GPT, and they were getting better and better, and they were catching up to Google essentially. And once they made one that was really quite powerful, that was GPT-3 basically, they said to themselves, maybe we can make a product out of this. And that's why they called ChatGPT GPT 3.5, because it's basically GPT-3, but they spent a long time training it, fine-tuning it to be a chatbot. And the way they did that was with a mechanism called RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback. So they basically do reinforcement learning. So they give it examples of what chat sessions look like. They present the results to a human, and the human says, this is a better example of a chatbot. This one doesn't make sense. Either it doesn't make sense because it's not answering the question, or it doesn't make sense because it's really unethical, or it's violating some norm that humans would consider necessary when you're engaging in conversation. So they incorporated tons of this human feedback, and it changed the GPT model substantially, right? It changed its personality. It changed what topics it could talk about, what topics it would talk about. It changed the format of the output that it would produce. So they put enough work into it that they decided, well, let's just call this GPT 3.5. Even though it's the same model, it's fine-tuned a lot. And then GPT 3.5 had another name, which was ChatGPT. And they just decided, what the heck, let's release it. Apparently, Sam Altman said there was pushback in OpenAI because people thought that no one would want to use this because it hallucinates, basically. Same problem that Google was having. And Sam Altman said, let's just try it. You never know. I mean, he comes from the startup world, so he's very familiar with just put it there and see what happens. But again, the reason it caught people off guard was because it was a big relative difference. In people's minds, AI was basically like Reddit suggesting a post or Twitter suggesting a post to you. So people could envision AI kind of surfacing information for you, right? Kind of like a Google search. And we had good mental representations for that already. We knew what a Google search was. So Twitter showing you relevant, or Facebook showing you relevant posts to what you just read, and we're not that surprised that a machine can do it. But unless you were following the text to image generation stuff, which came up a little bit in my PhD and I mostly ignored it, people were really surprised once an AI starts generating things, right? Generative AI. For whatever reason, it wasn't the image generation models that first came out in the public eye. And those are amazing as well, but they're one shot basically, right? You say, I want an image of this, great, and you get that result. A chatbot is really different because a human can take it in any direction that they like. So I think that's what really caught people off guard. In fact, if you think about prompting ChatGPT and saying, basically, for example, you can tell ChatGPT, you are a therapist, I'm in need of help with this thing, please chat with me. And that's actually like a general purpose model. Previously, if you wanted a model to act like a therapist, you would have had to either train from scratch on therapy related data, or at the very least fine tune the model so that it understood how to be a therapist. But instead, what ChatGPT did is they fine tuned it on how to answer questions, any questions at all. And it had enough of a knowledge base so that it could actually be pretty competent in a lot of different domains. So that's the real power of it. It's the first like general purpose model. It can solve problems in a whole wide variety of domains.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised as well?
I was quite surprised. I actually made a video about it, so you could watch that one. I actually talked to a PhD student who was interviewing at my university for a professor position, and I asked her about her research, and she was actually one of those people who was working on models that could kind of come back and forth with text so you could interact with them. Like for a customer support bot on a website, that was the use case that she was envisioning. And she said that basically you could go back and forth about 6 times and then the model exploded or like just stopped making sense. And she was not very enthusiastic about the future of that tech. Like she was like, it's cool research, but I don't think it's going anywhere. Was the impression I got.
How long ago was that?
I think that was in 2019 or possibly 2018. So like,
wow.
You know, a researcher in the field, like maybe 2 years before ChatGPT comes out, is like, this isn't really going anywhere.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was very surprised when ChatGPT came out because I thought had a somewhat inside view on it. And I told my parents, this will change the world. And I decided to start learning about it as much as I could. And that eventually led to me creating my YouTube channel, along with, I'm sure, lots of other people who suddenly developed an interest in AI at the same time. At least I can claim that because I had a speech recognition interest for a long time, that I was sort of adjacent to AI. But yeah, it really caught me off guard as well.
Well, I thought it would just mean since I use pen and paper, that's my job, pen and paper. I was just super surprised, and maybe if I would have known a little bit more, if I would have more interest in new technology, I would have seen it on the horizon. But that you were surprised as well, that's shocking.
The interesting thing too is that I think a lot of people thought AI would get there eventually, but most people would have estimated, including me, I would have estimated like 10 years or more, right? So the timeline, it wasn't that the technology was impossible, it was that the timeline was expected to be much longer. So we're entering this phase where technology is accelerating really, really quickly, right? Like something that we thought would take 10 years takes 3. Something that we thought would take 3 years takes 3 months. So if you look at the number of papers that are appearing at machine learning and AI conferences, it's literally growing exponentially. Like they're getting double the number of submissions they were like 2 or 3 years ago. So that makes it more likely that a really big and surprising relative delta will actually come about. There's disagreement amongst the community as to whether we actually need another big innovation like transformers that produced ChatGPT essentially. Some people think we can basically scale our existing techniques to bigger and bigger systems. And that's why there's lots of talk about, investment into AI hardware and that kind of thing, because that's basically the brute force approach. And then there are other people that think we definitely need one or maybe multiple further really impactful innovations that are going to be needed to advance AI further, like all the way to AGI, for example.
Now we talked about, advancement without rules. So what can we imagine what would happen if, but there are a lot of countries, especially what I learned from regulations in the European Union, there are a lot of people thinking about how can I regulate that thing? Well, that's going into places I don't know if I want that, to put it in simple words. So what do you think about that?
AI regulation?
Yes, laws on AI and regulations. What do you think? Where will the different parts of the world go to, or how much will AI be regulated? For example, in Europe, which wants to become the leading continent on AI regulations.
I haven't made too many videos about AI regulations because I always get half the number of views. No one is that interested, but I think it's very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, Europe is really pushing to be the place that thinks the most about AI regulation and really has a good environment both for companies and for consumers. And I really admire them, especially because of how GDPR worked out, right? The regulation that protects privacy. It gives citizens a lot of rights, including, for example, the right to be forgotten, which means that if someone wants to, they can demand that a company remove all the data that they have on that person. And interestingly, this also includes machine learning algorithms. So typically, if a company has a machine learning model, it's going to be trained on all the data that company could get their hands on. So if you are a client of that company, your data is definitely being used to train that model. So if the model's making predictions, for example, about new clients or about all the clients or something like that, that prediction is partially influenced by the data point that is you.
Mm-hmm.
So the GDPR created a lot of research in machine unlearning techniques. Like, how do you take a machine learning model and remove this data point? Because typically you don't want to retrain the entire system, because that takes like tons and tons of compute time, but you want to do some kind of fine tuning after the fact to remove the effects of this data point to remain in compliance with GDPR, essentially. And GDPR forced a lot of companies to basically say, okay, we need to be GDPR compliant for our European clients. And in North America, we can do different things. But just the act of having to become GDPR compliant because of Europe means that clients in North America actually get a better experience, because sometimes the companies are being more careful about how they handle data, et cetera. I mean, most companies would have a different policy for the Europeans because they can like sell more advertising in North America or whatever, but it still had a noticeable impact on how global companies think about their customer data. So it was very successful in my opinion. So when you come back to AI regulation and the European states passing laws about how training data should be treated, or even like how powerful AI models should become, what types of reporting should be done to the government about the amount of compute used to train those models, it means that Europe is going to have a much easier time tracking where are the companies that are actually training AI models, how advanced are those models, how dangerous are those models, where is AI being used to influence a lot of things in society, is AI being used to select doctors, is AI being used to select people eligible for insurance, is AI being used to bias university admissions. They're going to have a lot more visibility into all those processes and an understanding of how much AI is impacting society, as well as trying to spot the dangerous things and shut them down before they actually explode. So I'm a big fan of the AI regulation that Europe is trying to do. I mean, the US is probably not going to pass much AI regulation at all. Other countries are going to pick some middle ground. China is passing very strict AI regulations because they want to be able to enforce certain things related to the Communist Party. Like, they don't want people to be able to criticize them. They don't want people to be able to express too much free speech, because that might result in people organizing or thinking that the ways of the West are better, or learning that their government is doing genocide in the West, for example. So they want a ton of regulation in place so that they can actually see what companies are really doing and even have influence on what that model can say and do. And if it says or does the wrong thing, they can shut it down.
As a last thought, do you think that people who are not very familiar with AI are too afraid of AI, or are other people not afraid enough or not informed enough? Or is there, from your perspective, a part of the society that just closes it down, prevents itself from learning new technology, like maybe a couple of decades ago with the uprise of email? So is AI something which is part of our life now, and we have to learn to deal with it? And instead of being afraid, we should lean more into learning about AI? Or what are your thoughts on this ground of, oh, there is something new coming up, I'm afraid, I'm enthusiastic, I don't know, I'm just all over the place about AI? What's your thoughts on that?
People are always afraid of new technologies, but it's always funny to me to hear someone say they're afraid of AI, but they use Facebook all day. Like, to me, AI has been part of our lives ever since social media became a thing. And even generative AI is going to start being part of people's lives in the background, the same way that like banks and financial regulations and taxation rules and new surveillance equipment, all that stuff kind of gets developed in the background and deployed by large companies trying to do their job more efficiently. And it affects average citizens whether they realize it or not. So AI is definitely here to stay if you look at the amount of investment that's going into it. People don't realize it because it's a fast change, but also they are afraid, like you said, so they would rather just ignore it for a while and see what happens.
Maybe it goes away.
Maybe it goes away, exactly.
Like, oh, if I don't see it and don't hear it, it will disappear.
They hope that their own way of life can just continue without impact from this, right? And for some people that might be true. For others, their life will change completely. And that's a scary thing. So on the individual level, I think people are right to be a little afraid just because change is coming and change can be difficult. People have to learn to adapt to new circumstances. They have to figure out what they want now in the new situations. So I think it will impact people quite substantially on an individual level, especially also depending on what their job is, right? They might have to learn to do something different or learn new tooling to do their existing job. And then there's also the more existential fears, right? That like AI could run out of control and end up destroying humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think that is actually almost a little too scary for most people to think about. When I make videos about that, a lot of my comments are like, I don't want to think about this. But to me, as someone who likes to think about security and likes to understand worst case, average case, best case, I think it's actually the bigger concern because ultimately, even if people lose their jobs, they are still part of a human country with a human government that will look after people if it really has to. Even if it means burning through money like we all did during the pandemic to try to prop everything up and keep everything still working. But if AI becomes powerful enough that it decides to replace human governments, or if it becomes powerful enough that it just starts making its own technology without any input from us. I mean, the way Max Tegmark puts it is we're creating a new species. We're creating life 3.0. It's like we are inviting extraterrestrials to our planet and saying, here we are, what would you like to do? And they're extraterrestrials that are more powerful than us or will become more powerful than us. Mm-hmm. So that's a really severe problem, right? The alignment problem of figuring out how do you get an AI system to respect the desires of its human creators and actually to want the exact same things. If you're aligned in that way, then even if the AI is off doing its own thing and whatever, it's still going to do the things that humans would have done if a human had to make that decision, or that's the hope anyways.
Like the same values and the same direction, not suddenly thinking, oh, I could go totally the other way and deciding to destroy XYZ.
Exactly, but that's really hard to do. I mean, think about human cultures. They clash already over things like what should we use our land for? What should we use our money for? I have this ideology, you have that ideology. Mm-hmm. So if you imagine much more powerful entities and perhaps multiple nations having those much more powerful entities, even if the AI models are aligned with their human interests, you can still have a war. You can still have really bad scenarios, right? So AI might be not aligned and might just go do its own thing. AI might be perfectly aligned, but the human operators are doing human things and killing each other. And I think third, which is similar to the first, we could just have an accident. It's very easy when training an AI system to train it for the wrong goal. And you figure that out at the end. But meanwhile, you're training something that is quite intelligent and might be completely misaligned from the get-go, perhaps even intentionally. You know, when AutoGPT first came out, someone created a chaos GPT by just saying, I give you the goal of please destroy humanity, and then just let it run on the internet doing whatever it wanted to. Of course, it's not smart enough to get anything done. Basically Googled how do you make a bomb? And then started thinking about that for a long time and didn't do anything. But people will try the most outrageous experiments just to see what happens. So even if we know how to make aligned AIs, people doing experiments or figuring out how to train systems could have an accident that ends up releasing a rogue AI into the world. So I tell people that I'm a security person. I understand how many ways something can go wrong, especially when you're the defender. And in this case, humanity is basically the defender. We're trying to keep the status quo. We're trying to keep the planet operating as it is with biological life on it. Mm-hmm. And so it's nearly impossible to predict all the ways that an attacker, whether an intentional attacker or not, an attacker might go and circumvent all of the guards or thought processes that you've put into place. So to me, that's a really big problem. And it's one that most people don't understand thoroughly enough to realize how big of a problem it is. But the key point there is to get governments and large corporations to understand how big of a problem this is, because it's governments and corporations that have the money and that give the go-ahead to actually have, for example, large AI systems getting trained. So I realized this when I was starting to create my channel. And the reason that I created my channel was I realized governments won't do anything of their own accord. They will only do it if their citizens demand it. Or if it's a non-representational government, they'll only do it if they realize how much danger they're in. And so I think that with a YouTube channel that talks about AI, I can hopefully educate people about how dangerous this is in the long run. And as people educate themselves, they'll educate their friends, their family, and eventually you might have enough people in a country that are really clamoring and saying, hey, we need to pay enough attention to this. And I haven't really done that explicitly too much in my channel so far, because I don't know very much about AI safety, to be honest. Like, I'm just learning about it still myself. But that's where I really want to get to in the long run, is to be a bit of a catalyst to help people understand that this is a big problem. It's not like we're completely doomed, but if we don't think about it and we don't understand it, we're just putting our lives in the hands of the small number of governments and corporations that don't have humanity's best interests at heart, right? They're either trying to make lots of money or they're just trying to make sure they get reelected. And neither of those things contains, please make sure not to create a super strong AI and give it access to the internet.
So are we going to hear more about that on your next videos?
Absolutely. I'll be making an announcement about that a little bit soon. I'm going to be doing more safety related videos as we go forward. And I'll continue to make general purpose videos too that are just trying to educate people in general about AI, because I think it's only when people know nothing about AI that they're really scared of it, right? If they go, oh, this is kind of useful. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And oh, I see how this helps reduce fake news or deaths when people are driving or medical accidents or whatever, they start to get a little bit of interest in it. Then they're more willing to learn more about it and dive into it. And the scary aspects will kind of uncover themselves over time. And they'll realize that it's worth learning that information because they can and should do something with it. So that's my long-term goal.
That's interesting. I'm looking forward to learning more about it. I'm watching your videos and you got me hooked.
Well, thank you very much for participating in the interview, or whatever you want to call it. And I know we started talking a lot about therapy, and at the end we were just talking about AGI, but I guess that was bound to happen. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we close up?
As I mentioned before, I'm super happy that we had this conversation, that I learned how you think about AI in general, and using AI in my job. Of course, that helps me to see things now, which I haven't seen before. And I'm looking forward to see more of these interviews with many different professions, to see what's going on, how our world is going to change, and what impact does it have on different professions. So thank you very much for taking the time to explain all this to me. I begged you for a long time to have this conversation, and I'm super, super happy that we could talk for such a long time about, the impact of AI on, for example, my job and on my place, Germany, and the European Union. Thank you very much for that.
Now that you know about AI, you can look out in your job and think, man, everybody gets this wrong. I wish that there was some better way of doing this aspect of my job. And then you could say, let's make an AI model to do that. Everybody in the world seems to be doing that right now, thinking about how should I take AI to make this job a little bit better. So anyways, thank you very much.
I'll think back.
Anyways, thank you very much for being here. And I really enjoyed the conversation. So I would say good day, but it's probably good night at this point. Thank you very much, Ursula.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
If you liked this video, check out this previous one I made about mind upload, where we basically talk about how feasible is it for a human brain to be uploaded to the cloud, and what would that look like? Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.